See, I always figure there are things that people like and things that people don't like about Robert Duncan, which makes him a kind of difficult person to write about in terms of, you know, getting into the poetry. See, my experience was when I was an undergraduate at the University of Buffalo around 1986, 87, I read Duncan's book, Roots and Branches, or I tried to. And I thought, this guy is completely out to lunch because he's writing about trees, right? And at the time, I was very interested in beat poetry and very interested in Allen Ginsberg's work and interested in political poetry. And I thought, how can this guy get away with saying that he's an experimental poet when he's writing, you know, about the roots and the branches of the tree, which I equated with, you know, the kind of the tree poem, like the Joyce Kilmer kind of tree poem, or the Robert Frost kind of poem about nature. So I wanted to kind of use that as a starting point to open up this idea of field from there, which is why I wanted to ask, like, what do people think about Robert Duncan? But no one wants to say anything, so, okay. Okay, so as I talk, if you want to interject and say, wait a minute, I want to talk about that, then let's do that. This idea of the opening of the field, I've taken it from the title of a book of Duncan's from 1960, right, which I think is really the beginning of his mature work. But I wanted to go back into the beginnings of Duncan also, and maybe that's something that I should ask. Do you already know basic biographical? Okay. Okay. Duncan was born in 1919 in Oakland, California. He was, his mother died in childbirth, and 6 months later he was farmed out to a family. He was adopted by a basically middle-class family. The father was an architect. Mother was a school teacher. Briefly, she later became a housewife and socialite. They lived in Oakland, California, and Alameda, California for the first 4 years of Duncan's life. And he was adopted apparently based on his astrological chart. The parents were, the adoptive parents were theosophists. His adoptive grandmother was a member of a Hermetic Brotherhood in Oakland, California, which was, if you know anything about California in the early part of the 20th century, there was a lot of that kind of activity going on. There was a big Rosicrucian cult in San Jose, and the kind of West Coast post-Gold Rush era brought in also a lot of ideas about magic, tarot card readings, seances, so that all came into that Wild West culture. Duncan's adoptive family used that in a couple of different ways. It seemed like it was a serious religious pursuit in some ways, and in other ways they used that kind of information to tell them what to do in the way that people read horoscopes these days. You know, like should I be working at this job or this other job, and so on. Which is what happened in around when Duncan was about 8 years old, so 1926, 27, 28, the family decided to move to Southern California, to Bakersfield, where the father was going to get a job as a public works architect. But the idea within the family was that this decision had to be made by the astrologers who they consulted with. So I wanted to set that up as an idea about where Duncan is coming from as a kid. It's a very unusual kind of childhood. He's faced not only with being adopted, but also with being told that he's adopted, and being told that he was adopted for the specific reason, which is that in the context of the myths of the Hermetic Brotherhood, his chart shows that he had not been incarnated in an earthly form since the destruction of Atlantis. Okay. So it gives you a little bit of a sense of what's going to come into the poems in terms of these ornate divine orders, right? Throughout these early years, as he's growing up and as he's hearing these stories from his parents, he's also being told, well, you know, in your previous life, you were kind of, you know, part of this elite group, an intellectual. He had an aunt who was in the Hermetic Brotherhood who told him he had already been a poet, right? So that he should move on from there and do something new. He was also told that, you know, as the reason that he had been brought back was because the current, within his generation, the world would be destroyed by fire, right? So previous incarnation, the world is destroyed by water, right? The destruction of Atlantis. And so, you know, by the age of 8 or 9, he's faced with these anxiety dreams that he's having because his parents have told him that, you know, basically the world is going to end and that he's going to be a significant part of it. For whatever reason, Duncan doesn't become completely psychotic. He manages to survive this and to actually turn it into a poetics. And you know, the question does exist, how much of this does he make up afterwards and how much of it was really a part of his childhood? When I interviewed his sister, who still lives in Bakersfield, she was also adopted, you know, she said, well, I don't remember any of this. At the same time, she was a year younger. At the same time, when she showed me what she has, the little box of family trinkets, you know, she has all of the little booklets from the Hermetic Brotherhood, and the book about reading tea leaves, and the book about numerology, you know, and she says, well, this was my mother's stuff. But she doesn't remember it as being an active part of the household. So my sense of Duncan is always that he expanded that story when he felt like he needed to give a lecture or something and keep people from falling asleep, which is why I'm not sure how I feel about lectures, but I'm going to proceed anyway. Okay. 1936, Duncan went to the University of California at Berkeley. He was a freshman there. And I wanted to look at this as really the beginnings of this thing that I'm going to call the opening of the field, because what I mean by the opening of the field is I mean this, these moments where Duncan is coming into a sense of himself as a poet, right? And it starts for him in high school in Bakersfield. He has a teacher there who has studied a little bit of modernism, including the work of H.D. and D.H. Lawrence. And if you know about this unpublished book of Duncan's called the H.D. book, I don't know, you guys know about some, yes, no. It used to be available online, and I think it's disappeared again. Yeah, it's gone. Yeah, okay. The H.D. book is basically a 2-volume book that was an ongoing project for Duncan. It was a study of H.D.'s work, but it was also a study of modernism. And there's a lot of autobiographical information that comes into it. And there are 2 stories that he tells in the H.D. book about how he comes into poetry. And he saw the H.D. book as really not only a tribute to H.D., but also a tribute to these women who played this significant role in his life and in the building of his intellect, right? So, so at the opening of this field, at the beginning of this intellectual development, there are these key women. There's his mother, his adoptive mother. There's his mother's sister. Her name was Fayetta Phillip. His Aunt Fay. She was a diehard theosophist. She was a poet. She was a pharmacist. She had graduated from the University of California at Berkeley in the pharmacy program. She was one of the first women to go through the University of California system. and to graduate in the pharmacy program. There was this high school teacher named Edna Keough, and then there were women who he met at the University of California at Berkeley in 1936 and 1937. So I wanted to remark on that a little bit to give you a sense of this early life as a poet, and how dependent it was on his connections to these women. And this is one of the things that he doesn't really talk about or acknowledge in his later work, is the relationship with his stepmother. And he called her stepmother. She was adoptive mother, whatever, but he always referred to her as stepmother. Partly, I think, because whenever she was mad at him, she would remind him that he was adopted. So kind of creepy, right? Last year, Duncan's sister sent me a stack of letters that she had found in her garage, which were letters that Duncan had written to his mother while he was an undergraduate at the University of California, which I've drawn off of here to give you a little bit of a sense of how important that relationship was. And my sense also is that he was often writing home to explain to his family that he wasn't going to do anything that they wanted him to do, right? In this really kind of passive-aggressive way. It's interesting, both in terms of his educational life and his political life. So he's opening up what he calls cultural advancement, right, by creating these lists, and he's sending these lists home to his mother, right? This is a letter from probably early 1937. He says, cultural advancement, right? Music well underway. Beethoven, Bach, Brahms, Tchaikovsky, Stravinsky, Debussy, Ravel, Strauss, Wagner, etc., etc. He's about 18 here. Read Steinbeck's Mice and Men, Whitman's Leaves of Grass, Jeffers' Solstice, Art, El Greco, Federal Art Exhibit, Ella Young's Celtic Lectures. Now, Ella Young seems to have been a friend of his high school teacher, Edna Keough, who was in Berkeley and had a poetry club that he would attend. He says, at the beginning of a book, there's a book called The Years as Catches, he says this: by my 18th year, I recognized in poetry my sole and ruling vocation. Only in this art, at once a dramatic projection and at the same time a magic ritual in which the poet comes into being, only in this art, it seemed to me, could my inner nature unfold. I think with that recognition, we see basically the end of Duncan's academic career, about maybe 8 months into his academic career. He became he joined the editorial board of a college magazine at Berkeley called The Occident. And in a lecture he gives later in 1969, he has this great idea that he calls it the little freshman yes, because every time an unusual poem came to the table, everyone would say no to it, and he would say yes. So I'm going to read you this quote because it's kind of funny. He says, this is his later memory of it. This is from 1969. While there were some 20 poets who were ruling the whole scene at the University of California, and they all knew what poetry was. It was Auden and Spencer. And I couldn't see this, so when we were looking at student poems, they would be no, 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 and a little freshman yes. And I had a stubbornness that should have told me I was going to be able to hold out for the rest of my life for sure. What I didn't know, of course, is that I would be the only one to survive at the age of 50 to actually be a poet. And there's this is the moment where Duncan discovers modernism, and I think it's kind of important. I think what I really want to get at is the sense of when I talk about openings in Duncan's work, when I talk about how his work evolves, what happens at the beginning, it follows through. There's a linear sense of Duncan's work, and Duncan didn't like the idea of progress in poetry, but he talked about process. But we can see a progression in his work, that he starts off with these ideas of coming out of modernism, coming out of Pound, coming out of Stein, coming out of, I would say, a little bit out of the ideas of the Hermetic Brotherhood of his childhood, but also out of the information about the occult that comes from the modernism, that comes from HD, that comes from Pound, and comes specifically from the Cambridge classicists, and I'm thinking of people like Jane Harrison. And the list that happens at the beginning will continue throughout his work, and I think this is one of the difficulties that people have with Duncan, is that he'll just start making lists of things that he's reading in the middle of a poem, And then there's a sense, well, am I supposed to have read this, or what does this mean? And a lot of times it seems that it's really for his own reference, to chart his progress. He was an obsessive list maker. In his house in San Francisco, he had index cards that he would write down the names of all of the classical records that he would buy, and then he would kind of cross-reference them, who the composer was, who had actually played it, and then where he had it in another part of his collection. So he had these big drawers full of these boxes of index cards that were all handwritten, And the obsessiveness of those kinds of lists, I think that, he's always going to tell you what he's reading and where the quotation comes into the poem. It's something he gets a little bit from Pound, and I think we see that early. At Berkeley, working on this magazine, The Occident, he meets two writers, Robert Haas and a woman named Louise Antoinette Krauss. And he writes this letter to his mother in 1937. This is the great thing about the relationship with the mother, because he confesses everything to her, And he does this right into his late 20s, And he tells her who he's sleeping with, and and what political organization he's about to join, and how he's not going to join the army during the Second World War, and he's actually going to go to India and become a Buddhist, and all this stuff. And stuff that must have just really freaked her out over and over again. But and once a week he would write her these letters. So he said, this is a letter to his mom in 1937. I have met this boy at the I House and a girl who writes beautifully, Louise Krauss. Both of them encouraged me to read Eliot and to read Baudelaire, and then in parentheses, the one who wrote Flowers of Evil. I haven't read either yet. Both warned me to stay away from Stein. I told them that I was easily influenced by other people's cadences. It's an interesting moment, and actually I was very surprised when I saw this letter, because when Duncan talks about this in lectures, he says that at this point he had already read Eliot, and that he says that when he meets Louise Antoinette Krauss, she says, oh no, his work is too melodramatic, he shouldn't be reading Eliot, he should be reading Pound. That doesn't come up in any of the letters. So I get the feeling that this is an invention later to give this lecture on Pound. What comes up in the lecture in some, let's see, 69, so we're moving forward 30 years, he says, oh, well, I met with Louise Antoinette Krauss, and she said, oh, you must read Pound. And he says in the lecture, and I went trembling and running to a bookstore on Telegraph Avenue, and I found there the 30 cantos, and I opened the page and read, and then went down to the ship. And I said, I can't bear it, this is too much. For a whole week I went around with, and then went down to the ship. It was a poem that opened up exactly like an Oz book. Duncan, as a child, had read Frank Baum's Oz books obsessively. As an adult, those books became the center of his household. The books were in the library in the bedroom. They were kind of the sacred books. Again, that sense of field and opening into a space of the imagination, right? That he really got from the Oz books, and he talks about this at some point in his undergraduate career. That when he would meet academics and they would talk about what they were reading, he would always say, "Well, have you read the Oz books?" And then whoever said yes, he would spend time with them. You know? So again, and then another list that I wanted to read you from. This is another letter to his mother, right? Where he's explaining to her that he might not make it through this college thing. And he took great pride in that later in life. He always said, well, I was never initiated, I was never graduated, I was never analyzed, you know. He had this real kind of West Coast rebel idea about it. But here's another letter to his mom. If while I am sweeping I murmur Stravinsky a couple of times, I am in absolute ecstasy. Dos Passos, Dostoevsky, and Dickens, I would say to myself, write it down, on and on. For in the night and over flowers and in spare time talking, writing to myself, Cummings, Shakespeare, Shelley, Sherwood, Sheridan, Shaw, Sophocles, Stein, Schiller, Four Saints in Three Acts, Fall of a City, and Murder in the Cathedral, and Ezra Pound's cantos. He ended up getting thrown out of the fraternity house that he lived in partly because he was flunking out of school, and partly because he had decided to join something called the ASU, which was, let me get it right, the Associate. Wait, I want to get this right for you. The American Students Union of the Berkeley campus, which was a leftist group. He decided not to join the young communists, although he told his mother that he might, and that he had many friends who were young communists. He gets dumped by his fraternity, which was actually a Masonic fraternity, kind of associated with the Hermetic Brotherhood, which his parents had kind of gotten him involved in as a safe place to be on the road to whatever he was going to do. They wanted him to be an architect or a lawyer or something respectable. He then met a couple of women, and I'm going to get back to these women who kind of feed the whole educational process for him. And later, throughout his life, when he gives lectures or when he talks about politics, when he talks about his intellectual life, a lot of times he's stealing stories from these women. There's a lecture that he gives, it must be in the early 70s at Kent State University, where he talks about Eliot and the wasteland, and he says that the wasteland is a prediction of the atomic bomb. And it turns out that his Aunt Faye had written this whole thing about the wasteland and the atomic bomb, and it's like somehow he never mentions this in the lecture where it came from. But at Berkeley, leaving the fraternity, he meets a woman named Lily Fabili. She has a sister named Mary. They're from the Central Valley, and they grew up not far from Bakersfield in a town called Visalia. Came from a big Italian working class Catholic family. Had landed in Berkeley. Lily was working for a wealthy couple she was basically a housekeeper. Duncan is supported throughout his undergraduate career and into his early, Duncan is supported throughout his life by his mother's money, which wasn't a lot of money, but it was enough for him to get by, whereas most of his friends at Berkeley were working and kind of starving to death and living with each other in circumstances that weren't always that great. Meanwhile, in all of his letters home, he says, "Could you please send my allowance? You know, I'm joining the communists, and please send my allowance." Which, interestingly, his mother always did. She always sent him the money. When Duncan met the Fabili sisters and met another woman named Cecily Kramer, they influenced his political life. They persuaded him that he should think about this idea of the Second World War, that he should think about not participating, that he should think about not participating in the ROTC. He had to, mandatory military drills for undergraduates at Berkeley. And he opens up a chapter of the HD book with that, where he says, he's out on the green with these two women reading Joyce, and he says, "In the jostling streams, lower classmen, some in uniform, some still to change into uniform, went from all parts of the campus toward the gymnasium. It was the hour for ROTC classes that impended. 'You don't have to go,' Lily commanded, raising her hand in a dramatic gesture that had been delegated its power by the conspiracy of our company. 'Stay with Joyce.'" And then he writes in that same chapter of the HD book, he says, "Turning from the authority that the requirements and grades of the university or the approval of my teachers had once had over me to a new authority in the immediacy of what I had come to love, I came into a new fate." And I very much think that when Duncan comes around in 1960 to call this book The Opening of the Field, that it's really started there. That it started in high school in Bakersfield with this teacher who turned him on to Joyce and HD, and then it moves forward through these women he meets as an undergraduate. The other undergraduate who he meets at that time is a woman named Virginia Admiral, who was a painter. She had actually just graduated when he met her. She later came to New York when he was living there. They briefly talked about getting married, and then she ended up marrying a painter named Robert De Niro, and then Duncan became jealous and married her best friend, a woman named Marjorie McKee. And then Virginia Admiral, who was she was a student of abstract expressionist painter Hans Hofmann. She ended up having a kid who was Robert De Niro, the actor. So, so these are the women who are in charge of. I mean, they're actually, it's kind of this relationship that works two ways. He's running home from classes to talk to them, and they're all there, and he's saying, "I just wrote this poem," and he's insisting that they listen to these poems. And then they're saying to him, "Well, Robert, you have to do this, this, and this, read this, this, and this." And by the time he gets to his own sense of the political and starts writing these essays about the political, including this essay which is kind of like his early famous essay, The Homosexual in Society. He's talking about how important it is to disregard this sense of separatist groups and to understand that this field that we call humanity, he considers himself an anarchist, right? He considers that when we talk about see, there's an overlap in Duncan's work between the political and between the biological, and he's interested in systems, So when he sees the process of humanity, the evolution of humanity, he's very much against the black nationalist movement. He's very much against what he called the ghetto of San Francisco, which was the Castro. He said, "I'm not a radical queer," right? He was interested in this idea that that one best expressed oneself politically by being part of a continuum of humanity that disregarded what he called special interest groups. That idea entirely came from these women, from Mary and Lily Fabili. It came from Virginia Admiral, you know. And I remember when I interviewed Lily, she actually, I was shocked because we had gone out to dinner, we had talked a lot, and then she turned to me, you know, and she said, well, you know, the homosexuals in San Francisco, they're all, you know, part of this separatist organization. And she said, and as she was speaking, I was hearing the words of this essay from 1944 of Robert Duncan's. You know, she's saying, you know, humanity depends on this togetherness that has nothing to do with separatist groups, and on and on. And I thought all these years later, like, this is where this was coming from in Duncan's work, you know. And I mean, that's kind of a side issue, because then if you look at it from a kind of radical political position, you can say that Duncan was an incredibly homophobic homosexual, but which is what a lot of his gay friends said, that he wouldn't hang out with them at parties and stuff. But I'm not going to go there right now. I wanted to get at this basic opening of the field. So, okay, well, we can actually, I can start with that passages piece. How long have I been talking? A half hour? Okay. Passage over water. I will go to that homosexual moment. When Duncan is at Berkeley, he meets a graduate student, a guy named Ned Fahs, F-A-H-S. Ned was he was studying French. He was getting his PhD. Duncan fell in love with him. He was 10 years older than Duncan. Duncan ended up going to the East Coast with Ned, and when their relationship ended in 1939, he wrote this poem, Passage Over Water, which is, again, I think for Duncan is a very significant poem because it's at the beginning of this work of opening. And the word passage is very important because one of the themes of Duncan's work later is this idea of passages, and he has a series of poems called Passages. So I'm going to read this, Passage Over Water. We have gone out in boats upon the sea at night, lost, and the vast waters close traps of fear about us. The boats are driven apart, and we are alone at last under the incalculable sky, listless, diseased with stars. Let the oars be idle, my love, and forget at this time our love like a knife between us, defining the boundaries that we can never cross, nor destroy as we drift into the heart of our dream, cutting the silence slyly, the bitter rain in our mouths and the dark wound closed in behind us. Forget depth bombs, death, and promises we made, gardens laid waste, and over the wastelands westward, the rooms where we had come together bombed. But even as we leave, your love turns back. I feel your absence like the ringing of bells silenced, and salt over your eyes and the scales of salt between us. Now you pass with ease into the destructive world. There is a dry crash of cement. The light fails, falls into the ruins of cities upon the distant shore, and within the indestructible night I am alone. This theme of water comes partly out of a recurring dream that Duncan has as a kid, which is interpreted, of course, by his parents because they're always waiting to hear his dreams because he's the chosen one from Atlantis. There's a great story that he tells a friend of his, a writer, Bobby Louise Hawkins, who was married to Robert Creeley, and he tells Bobby Louise that he would do this trick on his parents. He would come down to breakfast in the morning, and he would sit down at the table when he, just a little kid, like 10 or 11, and he would say, I had the most incredible dream last night. And everyone would stop what they were doing, so that they could write it down and take it to be interpreted. But one of the dreams that he talks about as a recurring dream is this dream where it's a kind of disaster dream, where it comes up in the opening of the field. There's a children's game of ring around of roses, and then he is he's in the center. He's crowned the king. He ascends to the throne, and there's this sense of impending disaster, like a flood, right? His parents tell him it's his memory of what happened in Atlantis. He also points out that in Freudian terms, it's the memory of birth trauma, right? So, and also he's coming into writing all of the beginnings of his work are at a time when he's obsessed with the beginnings of the Second World War. So, and here you have it at the end of this passage over water. The light falls into the ruins of cities upon a distant shore. And I think that we can call this, if you want to look at Duncan's work, if you want to look at the range of Duncan's work from beginning to end, you're going to see, first of all, the passages, the opening, the corridors, right, that come out of his father's study of architecture. There is a poem, I think it's passages 9, it's called The Architecture. We're going to see from there the recurring theme of the water and that sense of loss and that story of Atlantis. In the opening of the field, he actually, you see how significant that poem is, Passage Over Water. And it's funny because it's a poem that I've rarely looked at and haven't thought about that much as really the beginnings of Duncan's work. But we see this is going to be 20 years later, about 1958, he writes a poem called The Structure of Rhyme 11. Right, now if you look at Passage Over Water, now listen to this poem. Here's the poem 20 years later. There are memories everywhere then, remembered we go out, as in the first poem, upon the sea at night to the drifting. Of my first lover there is a boat drifting. The oars have been cast down into the shell. As if this were no water but a wall, there is a repeated knock as of hollow against hollow, wood against wood, stooping to knock on wood against the traps of the night fishers. I hear before my knocking the sound of a knock drifting. It goes without will through the perilous sound, a white, sad wanderer where I no longer am. It taps at the posts of the deserted wharf. Now, from the last years of my life, I hear forerunners of a branch creaking. All night a boat swings as if to sink, weight returning to weight in the cold water. A hotel room returns from Wilmington into morning. A boat sets out without boatmen into 20 years of snow returning. If you know Duncan's work, you might know that he opens the beginning of his groundwork book with a poem called Achilles' Song, which also has that theme of the boat, and is actually a poem that responds in some way to his connection to HD. And he references that at the end of the poem. This is the other thing I think that's interesting about Duncan's work, is that when you're not sure where he's coming from or where he's going, he'll give you a footnote. He likes to create all of these cross references. Okay. So that's what I wanted to get at in terms of a start of what I call this opening of the field, the sense of passage that comes from the early dream life, that comes from the stories that come from the parents, that comes from these women who he meets at Berkeley, and then he enters into the poetry and starts to, find his voice. and move into it. When he gets to the opening of the field, right, when this book, when he begins into this book, he writes this poem, Often I am permitted to return to a meadow. And he actually writes letters to friends, and he says, and now he writes the poem, he sends them the poem, he says, and now I have a book. You know, and it's a clear moment for him. You know, the book ends up being some 53 poems, which is it's a real project book where he decides there are going to be these themes, like he constructs it in this certain way. It's a whole, it's the beginning of a universe for him. He likes to think of the book as this place of, you know, of actual structure, of a place that where one can actually enter, of a metaphysical space that one is actually steps into, which is where his work is going to differ from Jack Spicer's work, right? Because Spicer is going to say, well, you can try to do that, but the poem is always, there's an artifice to the poem, so it's not really a metaphysical structure in that way. The passage and the sense of boundary again comes into this poem. I want to read this. I also want to know how long I should talk for. Okay. I think I know where to end this. Okay, I got it. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up for you so that you can then go right into the work and see where these threads lead. Okay, so I'm just going to open it out. Often I am permitted to return to a meadow, as if it were a scene made up by the mind that is not mine, but is a made place that is mine. It is so near to the heart, an eternal pasture folded in all thought, so that there is a hall therein. That is a made place created by light, wherefrom the shadows that are forms fall, wherefrom fall all architectures I say are likenesses of the first beloved, whose flowers are flames lit to the lady. She it is, queen under the hill, whose hosts are a disturbance of words within words, that is a field folded. It is only a dream of the grass blowing east against the source of the sun, in an hour before the sun's going down, whose secret we see in a children's game of ring a round of roses told. Often I am permitted to return to a meadow as if it were a given property of the mind, that certain bounds hold against chaos, that is a place of first permission, everlasting omen of what is. The main text that Duncan has kind of stumbled upon, that this poem comes out of, is he's reading the Zohar, which is this mystical interpretation of the Old Testament. He's reading a section of it which is an interpretation of Genesis, in which Abraham is about to die, and he's led to this field by God, and the field opens up and unfolds, and there's a cave within the field where Adam is buried, and Abraham and his wife Sarah are supposed to find their spots next to Adam and Eve in this cave, and then God is going to refold this field. So Duncan had picked up this 5-volume set of the Zohar in around 1952, and he seems to have taken part of it with him when he went to Europe, which would have been 1955? Is that right?
55.
Okay.
That sounds right.
Yeah.
Okay. He writes this poem, partly thinking about what he's read in the Zohar, and he decides that he's going to write this book, The Opening of the Field, which is going to explore a field of three themes, right? first of all, this idea of field. Secondly, an idea of the dead, right? We see the dead buried in the field. And thirdly, his third idea is that there's a theme called the law, right? So that when you get to, and a lot of what you see in the Zohar is this idea of law. And he's very specific that this is not about man-made law. This is about cosmic law, right? This is about evolutionary law. This is about spiritual law. This is about, metaphysical law. So when you go into the opening of the field, he gives you all of those themes in the first poem. Where from fall all architectures I am. There you have that figure of the atom, right? The first beloved. The theme of the dead. She it is queen under the hill. You have Persephone, right? But you also have the cave and the field, and that's whose hosts are a disturbance of words within words. That is a field folded, right? Straight out of the Zohar. Again, he brings in, now he's going to link this back to the early childhood dream, whose secret we see in a children's game of ring, a round of roses told, right? So he's putting himself in the cosmic drama, right? This is my story. I was from Atlantis, now I'm here, and this is what's going to happen, and there's this great, the great continuity of the human, beginning with the architecture of this first man who's buried in this field, in this cave, So it goes on from there. So every poem in this book takes one of these themes and pulls it apart and pushes at it in some way. I know that some people have been reading those Levertov Duncan letters, and he pushes at that in the poem A Storm of White, where he's living in Stinson Beach and the cat dies, So he goes into the theme of the dead with the dead cat. Duncan is he's a great democratic poet in that way, because he'll take anything that's happening and he'll bring it in as a sense of part of the cosmic drama. It's like, he's like the classic paranoid. Everything takes on meaning. It's like the fork falls off the table and then that has to go into a tube because there's some reason that happened. So that's kind of like the basic trajectory that I wanted to build in terms of getting at a sense of how the work proceeds. And once you get out of the opening of the field, all of the other books fall into that order, And by the time you get to the end of it, you have this beautiful unfolding of Duncan really as a master in terms of, being, I think, a metaphysical poet on the level of his favorite 17th century metaphysical poets. If you look at the end of Groundwork 1 with this poem, Circulations of the Song, and the beginning of Groundwork 2, An Alternate Life, right? It's wonderful, incredible love poems that I think are really unmatched in, his generation. They're kind of amazing. So maybe that's probably like what I need to say, and then I can, if you have questions, maybe that's what to do now, I think. Yeah, okay.
Let's clap.
This poems, it seems like, also are a nice pair, because they bring out some of what you're talking about in the sense of these things are occurring, but I'm often reapproaching them from a new direction.
Yeah.
And it's I like the fact that in Passage Over Water, but even as we leave, your love turns back. He's in a position which it seems like he more often is in the early poems of Orpheus.
Yeah.
And often when we're permitted to return to a meadow, he's with Eurydice.
Yeah.
Which is a strange and interesting shift that he's permitted to return, as in the return to spring that she's permitted. But
Yeah.
So it's but he's the lost one, potentially.
Yeah, but then there's also, I think, the kind of the myth of the kind of early agricultural society myth of the old king and the new king, right? right? So you have to kill off the old king at the end of the year. It's like that's like the New Year's where you have the old guy leaving and then you have the baby crawling in, right? Yeah, same kind of thing. Yeah, definitely.
Talk a little bit more about fate. I like the phrase a new fate, and also the connection between the field and being fated both from loss in the way that the myth of Atlantis plays in, and also fated towards loss, which looks like part of what's going on in the passage over water. That very strong ending within the indestructible night I'm alone. So is there a way that, can you say something more about how fate fits into your sense of Duncan?
Well, I think that's, it had to have been a key anxiety for him because this was what he was born into, this idea of fate, And I mean, I think that it in some ways, it had to have been very problematic for him as well because he had to interpret everything that was happening around him in relation to the fate that he had already been instructed was his fate. I mean, he would talk about how it didn't matter what he did as a kid; he couldn't really get his mother mad or like do things that regular kids did because she would say, well, that's your fate, this is why we adopted you, you're going to be monstrous, and so he couldn't really get a rise out of her in that way, and it's interesting because when I met his sister, what happened in the adoption was that he was the one with the bad karma and the younger sister was the one with the good karma, right? So she had another interesting problem is that she couldn't get anyone's attention because they just figured she was going to do her thing and she'd get good grades in school and she went on this kind of standard path. She got married to this guy who was an insurance salesman and then she had some kids and stayed in Bakersfield her entire life. Really had very little sense of what Duncan had done with his life, although she was definitely curious about him. So I think that my sense of it is that Duncan was always trying to reinvent fate in a way, and through the poetry that was his way of controlling, I think, what happened, and saying, and he often said, well, I wasn't initiated into this theosophical world. It's not my world. Poetry became the vocation, so-called. Poetry became the religion in a lot of ways. But I mean, he has a letter to his mother about the bombing of Hiroshima, where he takes the stand that this shouldn't have happened. There should have been a group of assassins that got rid of these guys. He really wanted to rewrite that scene.
Fate might be related to this idea of a permission, and it's a return back to a place of first permission, and yet there's also, often I am permitted, there is something, a permit isn't necessarily a license, it can also be an obligation of a sort, but that it's a return back to a place of first permission there's a kind of a renovative vector in that you're returning back to this one spot. So fate relative to permit, I think, is a good place to consider that.
Yeah.
His rebellion of becoming a poet is in fact not really rebellion because he already was a poet.
Right.
So I mean,
Right.
so that frustration, which is interesting, given too what seems to be an anxiety that you mentioned in regards to what he sees, his openness, perhaps over openness to influence from the one letter that you mentioned. Which I think ties into this sort of almost oxymoronic idea of new fate. The one difference perhaps in the more mature poetry is more of a sense of himself as poet than as a poet influenced by other poets. I mean, does that sound right in some respects?
Yeah, I'm trying to process what you just said.
I mean, the Passage Over Water seems to be honestly not a great poem.
Oh, sure.
Yeah,
Well, that's,
and,
you know, that's the...
And, you know, sort of riddled, I mean, ships passing in the night, essentially.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's why it's interesting to see that that progress. No, to get to the end of the work and see what he's done with that. That he's taken those images and it's like taken on the yeah. No, he says this great line. He says, "I was a poet who started without talent." You know, yeah. So.
This is kind of shifting gears, but I was just kind of wondering what like brought you to the project of devoting all this time to writing a biography of another poet at this point. Like, I loved hearing those passages from the novel yesterday. Just wondering what's going on for you right now as a poet with these turning to these other projects and you know, helping you to clarify your poetics in some way or work through some stuff.
Yeah, I've always been a really slow writer when it comes to poetry, so I like to have different things going on. When I was at the University of Buffalo, I studied with Robert Creeley, and he brought in a poem of Duncan's to a class. He brought the Venice poem, which is, again, I mean, it's a very ornate poem. It was very difficult for me to read it on my own. It's a long poem, and he read, and all Creeley did was he read it out loud, and he would stop at the end of a line, and he would say, "Wow, wasn't that great?" You know, and I became convinced. I was like, "This is really great. Like Creeley thinks it's great. It must be great," you know. And at the same time, I was working at the poetry rare books collection at the university. I was like a student assistant or a work study student. They had just purchased Duncan's collection. They had his notebooks, you know. So I kind of snuck in there, and I was interested in the notebooks, and then the guy who was the curator said, "Well, do you want to catalog these notebooks, you know?" Because and they were very, everyone there was like, "Don't touch the Duncan stuff," you know. So I said, sure. So I spent about 2.5 years, you know, working there like 10 hours a week or something, and reading. I read all of Duncan's notebooks. There were 81 notebooks, and I made a list of what was on every page of each notebook. So, you know, about 10 years later, I was out teaching at the Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado, and the poet Ed Sanders was giving a lecture on book-length research projects. And I was talking to him afterwards, you know, and I said, "Well, I should really do something like that." And he said, "Yeah, you should write a biography of Robert Duncan." So that was like 1997. So that was when it started, and yeah. So that's kind of how it happened, but.
And do you feel his, like, that kind of deep, you know, immersion in his life and his work? Like, when you sit down to write now, do you feel him as a presence in some, you know, particular way?
I think that maybe other people have said this, but writing biography, it's kind of like being married to someone, you know? Like, it fades in and out. Like, there are moments when you really love the person and feel completely engaged and it feels natural. And there are other times when you just think, this guy is a complete asshole, you know? It's like, I just... So... but... I still do have that sense of, when I look at the poems, I think, you know, what a beautiful moment this is. Yeah, so that definitely remains, yeah.